Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the general track of SciPy 2021. I'm the host of this particular session. My name is Madikin Monk. Before we get started, I just want to tell you all about the Q&A. So there are two options for asking questions. The first is raised hands. If you raise your hand, I can bring you up on stage after the talk is over, and you can ask your question orally as you would in an in-person conference. And the other is the Q&A, and that is a text-based submission. I encourage you all to raise your hand so we can bring you up, and we will have at least 5 minutes for Q&A at the end of this talk. Now, without further ado, let's hear it from Roland.
Hi there, my name is Roland Thomas. I'm from the Data and Analytics Services group at NERSC, and I'm going to tell you a little bit today about the how and why of monitoring scientific Python usage on our supercomputer. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the framework that we've put together for analyzing the data using Python tools and some of the interesting results that we've found from our monitoring so far. NERSC is the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center. It's the primary scientific computing facility for the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Science, which in turn is the largest federal sponsor of basic research in the physical sciences in the United States. That means that it's our responsibility to provide high-performance computing, storage, consulting help, training, and much more to over 8,000 scientists funded by the office's 6 different program areas. To do this, we run supercomputers, some of the most powerful and biggest systems on the planet. We have 2 systems on the floor right now at NERSC. Cori, which is the system on the left, is the older system, the one that has been running for the last 6 years, and Perlmutter, which is number 5 on the top 500 list, which is now being prepared for the first users to get onto it. This talk is going to be all about the monitoring that we've done with Python on Cori. And it's probably going to cover about a year's worth of data now that we've been doing this. All right, so why are we doing this? Workload data is what we use to make decisions about supercomputer procurements and how we support our users. It's important to understand what users are actually doing, not from what they say they do necessarily, but from what the data their interaction with the system generates. That doesn't mean that user surveys and requirements reviews aren't useful. They're extremely useful, but they go alongside the data collection that we do. Often we find that the data collection actually gives us a way to open those kind of conversations with users. Workload analysis is used for the procurement planning in the sense that we want to understand where users are now, what their constraints are on the current systems, and how new systems need to improve to support their workflow needs. And also, what kind of support are we going to need from vendors in order to help users transition to new architectures and systems? In terms of user support, once a system is on the floor, we want to be able to detect problematic or suboptimal usage in the workload and help users find opportunities to clarify or improve our documentation, retire underutilized software and services so that we can focus our support on the most important areas, watch for usage trends emerging so that we can get out ahead of those and help users through support. And finally, to advocate for users' needs with our vendors, with developers, or internally with each other. The vendors I'm talking about are Cray, NVIDIA, Intel, AMD, and so on. So what about scientific Python usage? In the HPC space, of course, Python is the newcomer. However, we've seen dramatic growth in use and support requests over the past 5 to 10 years. Our vendors and policymakers, our program managers, are actively curious about the role of Python in high-performance computing, and we want to know how it should impact procurement and support. The workload analysis that we did most recently was in 2018, and it seemed to be missing the full extent of Python use on our system. The focus was on the use of the batch queues, the compute nodes, but our question is whether or not that is sufficient in particular, but also we need to go deeper. We need to understand what libraries or frameworks people are actually using when they're using Python. If you say, 100 users are using Python, it's kind of like saying 100 people are using Bash. We need to actually know what they're doing when they're running Python. And so our goal was to try to support the workload analysis effort. And so we started a project called Monitoring of Data Services. It's our business intelligence project. The goal is to help represent the data stack in workload analysis, and Python monitoring, of course, is a huge part of that. All right, so what do we need to do if we want to monitor all the Python that's going on a supercomputer? Our goal is to monitor any Python that's been installed on the Cori system. That includes Python that's installed by the vendor at user bin, but also Python that's installed by us in software environment modules. We also want to capture user installations through Conda environment, SPAC, build from source, whatever. Also, since we support containers through a runtime called Shifter, which is kind of like Docker on HPC, we want to be able to capture Python usage inside containers. Again, the goal is to figure out what libraries and frameworks appear to be the most important. We also want to monitor Python usage not just in batch jobs, but also on login nodes, Jupyter nodes, workflow nodes, other special nodes like GPU nodes, and large memory clusters that are attached to Cori. We want to allow users to opt out instead of requiring them to opt in. Their participation, however, is extremely valuable to us. And so part of the reason that we're talking about this at SciPy is so that we can kind of spread the word about why we're doing this. Also, opting in, getting users to opt in is much harder than asking them to, giving them the opportunity to opt out. And finally, we definitely don't want to have our monitoring framework cause hardships for staff or for users. Things should kind of just work through standard operating procedure on our side, and for users, our philosophy is that missing some of the data is not as bad as crashing their jobs. There are a number of ways to approach this problem, and in the paper we go into more detail about the related work. Probably the one to call out here is Xalt, which is the third one down from the top, which does something pretty similar to the approach that we took. But it does a few things that that we're not quite comfortable yet, and also has some requirements that we can't meet on Cori. All right, so the actual technique that we use is basically just to use Python's own batteries to do this, and it's inspired by some work done by Colin McLean when he was at NCSA. He's actually at LBL now, and he's our friend and colleague. Basically, the idea here is that you use a feature of the standard library called site customize, which is imported at every normal Python startup. And within that module, you insert an exit handler. And what that exit handler does, it's a function that simply reads sysmodules, which is the list of everything that's been imported up to that point, and serializes it to disk. All of this is just standard Python library things, no external dependencies, and it's very easy to deploy. It has a number of features that we like about it, or issues or things we have to take care of. We have to get it into users' syspath, their search path, in order to opt out. We think unsetting Python path or resetting Python path is a good way to do that. You might lose imports in certain situations if the exit hook doesn't fire, for instance, because of an abnormal shutdown. You may lose some data. This can actually be instrumented into Shifter, the container runtime, pretty easily through a volume mount. One of the important things is to make the installation of these modules happen local to the node so that it's not being imported over the network. And we need a robust solution for storing the data. And of course, we need to be very careful about how we get this into everybody's path. You can try this out yourself. You just need a Python installation that you can install site customize into. I used a Docker container here. And you can see that we write a little function that just prints out what's in sysmodules and says hello. And so when you run it, first you see the hello from site customized because that's running at startup. Then you see the exit handler fire, and you see that it's printing out all of the stuff that was in sysmodules. All right, so how do we manage this process? It's a little bit more complicated than just printing that stuff out. There are three kind of things you need to do. Inspect the Python process, specifically look at sysmodules and the exit handler. Gather additional data for context and filtering downstream. Report what is observed in sysmodules to whatever storage you're using along with that context. We put together a little module called customs. It's named that because its job is to inspect and report on packages that are being imported. On the right-hand side, there's a list of some of the additional metadata that we capture there. We don't capture all of sysmodules. That would be kind of a large amount of traffic, and we kind of wanted to start small and build up, so we use a search list of about 5 or 6 dozen modules. There's a reporter object that forwards those hits along with the context to Elasticsearch. And 1 in 10,000 Python invocations goes ahead and forwards all of sysmodules to help us find emerging packages when they happen. For deployment, we use RPMs to get them installed into the system images, and we coordinate that with our system administrators. And we have a battery of integration tests and system checkout tests we do to make sure this isn't going to cause problems. This slide is a list of some of the similarities and differences between our monitoring and Blue Water's Python. Mainly the thing to point out here is that we log through syslog to our Elasticsearch database in a central monitoring infrastructure called Omni. Once the data is there, we have to figure out how we're going to look at it. Omni provides Kibana, which is a visualization framework for dashboards, and that's fine once you get the hang of it. Once you get the hang of the search language and things, the query language and things like that. But often we found we have deeper questions than Kibana could provide us answers to, and so we wondered whether or not the PyData ecosystem could help us answer these questions. Our requirements for that are based on our actual workflow. We want to be able to interactively explore as much of the data as possible and firm up prototype explorations into production. And then we want to communicate what we find to stakeholders. That means staff, management, policymakers, program managers, users, and developers. And sometimes handing those folks a full-blown Jupyter notebook is not the way to go. A dashboard seems to be much better. So the solution that we put together here was to use Jupyter notebooks for the interactive exploration piece, use Dask and cuDF, CuPy, and a GPU cluster to accelerate the analysis on as much data as possible at a given time interactively. Papermill to parameterize and execute the notebooks in batch on a schedule through Slurm, and a package called Voila for rendering the notebooks as dashboard in a separate auxiliary system apart from the HPC cluster using Rancher and Kubernetes. We tried to use a single notebook for each analysis, kind of as a challenge, and a single Docker container is used for all three contexts: interactive, batch, and dashboard use. And best of all these tools are things that our own users can use, and so we're kind of drinking our own champagne by doing this. I have a couple of slides about some of the setup. The first is, I mentioned, we tried as an experiment to do a single Jupyter notebook approach by using cell metadata tags to manage which cells get executed in which context. So for the exploration and analysis part, there's a set of cells that are kind of at the top of the notebook that run on the supercomputer or on the GPU cluster, mainly for data cleaning and reduction, testing models, then writing reduced data to disk. And this is done interactively or in batch with Jupyter or Papermill. The dashboard part is kind of more to the bottom. There are no GPUs in the Kubernetes cluster. So we kind of have to rely on reduced data for visualization there right now. This is executed interactively or using the dashboard. And the Jupyter Lab Voila extension is very helpful for prototyping. Downsides for this are that you have to manage those tags and it's easy to forget them, and you might end up with a lot of boilerplate code that gets repeated in the notebook. For productionizing, that's pretty easy. Once you have a template notebook, you just kind of feed it to Papermill and submit it as a batch job. All right. I have a video here because live demos of dashboards are a bit dangerous. And so I'm going to go ahead and play this and try to make sure that we don't get too far behind. Our dashboard's at mods.nurse.gov/public. That's the public dashboard. If too many people go there, it might crash. That was the home page that you saw, and this is the dashboard that I'm talking about for the quarterly analysis. So we take all of the data within one quarter, and we make all the visualizations for that. We deduplicate by job or by user or by library, and we look at usage on either the Haswell or the KNL partition of Cori, or whether or not what people are using on the GPU cluster as well. So this is I believe this is the quarterly view right now. And there should be another view that's all of the data. I think that's coming up next. All right. And all of the data here has been gathered since almost about a year ago. We've actually been testing out the monitoring framework for a bit longer than that, but a year ago is when we were able to expand the monitoring through collaboration with the system administrators to be able to monitor each and every Python invocation on the system. that's not also opted out. The video goes a little bit longer to show an additional dashboard, which is Jupyter usage. We keep Jupyter usage statistics. I believe these are a little bit out of date because we made the video before the last run was done, but the total number of Jupyter users this quarter, I believe, is about 1,300. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video and move ahead and talk about some of the results in a little bit more detail. Some of the visualizations here might look a little bit different from what's in the paper because we've been trying to adjust, or actually these will look like what's in the paper, but what you see on the dashboard is going to look a little bit different from what's in the paper because we're continuing to improve the dashboard. So some unsurprising results about Python on our system. About 30% of users are running jobs using Python. That seems like what our expectation was approximately. That's everything that's using Python even incidentally in a job or to power an analysis or actually be the main job step there. What we found also is the vast majority of jobs running that are using Python are running on the Haswell nodes. These are a bit easier to get performance out of for Python applications than KNL, so it's not that surprising. Some more surprising things, though, are shown on the right. 95% of jobs that run actually seem to use a user-provided Python. So that's a Conda environment or a container. So users really like to customize their Python environment on our system and use that for their production work. That's not to say nobody's using the nurse-provided module at all. Across all the nodes, 63% of users are using the module. One thing that we found that was another surprise is that only about 30% of jobs that appear to be eligible to use the Intel Math Kernel library are actually doing that. These would be things that are using NumPy, SciPy, scikit-learn in a Conda environment, for instance. And it could be because people are pulling things in from CondaForge and they're getting open BLAS for that. Not sure if this is actually going to be a big deal in terms of performance for people, but we thought that people might be going for the optimized library for the hardware that they're running on. But it seems like 30% is what people are doing right now. So here's the main thing we were after, the top 20 tracked libraries. Our expectations were mostly what we found, that NumPy is going to be a big deal, SciPy, visualization libraries, Jupyter, AstroPy, because we have a lot of cosmologists on the system. Deep learning libraries are going to be ranked pretty low because we don't have that many GPU nodes on Cori. But the most surprising thing we found, at least to us, was the prevalence of multiprocessing in the workload. We filtered out incidental multiprocessing use that comes from the Conda tool or the Mamba tool. But what we find is that users are doing indirect or either direct use of multiprocessing or doing it indirectly because some other library actually uses it under the hood. Engaging with users, we find that what they like is the easy parallelism that they get from here, from multiprocessing, a lot of data parallel work, and it just seems to be a great fit for them. However, they're not scaling beyond a single node that way. In terms of batch job sizes, what we find is that most jobs are small, but some jobs are big. And that's pretty normal for the workload at NERSC. That's not specific to Python, and it doesn't indicate that Python only can run at the smallest scales. Certainly not. At the larger scales, Python is being used with NumPy and NPI4Py, which is not that surprising. It's kind of the traditional kind of set of libraries we would expect to see there. Other things we noticed were that PyTorch jobs seem to scale larger than TensorFlow jobs. Maybe it's easier to do that. Dash jobs, however, have not scaled beyond about 1,000 nodes. What we think is that these results and some others indicate that we need to do a little bit more work to make scaling up Python jobs on the system easier for our users. One of the fun things we decided to try to do was to see if we could detect any interesting co-occurrence of modules. So we created kind of a correlation matrix of imports. And of course, a bunch of the really strong correlations are just going to be because things are dependent on other things. So we kind of filtered those out, filtered some of those ones out in the smaller kind of clipped version of the correlation matrix on the right to see whether or not there are any interesting surprises there, and there are a couple. So mostly we focus in on those libraries that are focused on delivering parallelism, so NPI4Py, multiprocessing, or Dask. What we find is that AstroPy and NPI4Py tend to get used together a lot. And we thought that was very interesting. Does that represent an opportunity for collaboration between the two developer communities, especially in the HPC context? It may mean that. Or maybe there are opportunities for performance improvements, in particular on the I/O side of things for AstroPy. Multiprocessing, it's mostly interdependencies with other libraries, but could there be a vendor out there or a developer who's interested in accelerating or improving performance of multiprocessing for our users on our nodes, our many core nodes? I think that might be a very interesting thing to engage about. But what we find is that people start out with multiprocessing kind of because they've written something on their laptop and it's just easier to use multiprocessing the first time they get on the system and bring that code over from the laptop. Dask seems to go with Xarray and NetCDF. No surprise, that looks like the climate and earth sciences community. Some use of Dask, however, seems to be incidental. When you reach out to users, sometimes they're not really aware that the Dask is part of the ecosystem that they're actually using. They're not using it to scale up. But here we found that one thing that we really need to do is work with users to make it easier to scale up and install. Right, so I think that brings me close to the end of the talk. In conclusion, I'll say what we've done, which is I think we've done a pretty good job of meeting our goal to enrich our insights into workload analysis of Python on the Cori system. We've created a pretty basic but reusable framework for inspecting and reporting imports, and the link to the repository is at the bottom of this slide. We've used some of the data that we've collected to start new conversations with users, vendors, the ones that I mentioned before, and developers. As an experiment, we tried to put together a pipeline where we could do prototyping, production, and publishing, all with a single Jupyter notebook. And that worked pretty well, leveraging cell metadata tags. There might be work going on to make that kind of easier to manage. I'll say that I like that workflow, but not everybody on the team was really excited about that as a goal and thought that it was a little bit more complicated than it needed to be. We use a single container on both the HPC side and on the Kubernetes deployment on the auxiliary system spin for the dashboard. That keeps everything consistent. In terms of future work, we're going to install our monitoring framework on the new system, Perlmutter, and try to understand the CPU workload and how much of it can migrate over to the GPU system. Also, we want to understand how users respond to the new system and whether or not there's any change in the behavior in the use of Python that we see there. We also want to expand the analysis to merge the data that we've collected with the user identity, what kind of science they're doing, and banking in terms of like what projects they're actually attached to. And of course, apply machine learning to understand the data better if we can, if it helps. There may be also finally potential points of collaboration or integration with some of the more standard tools like Xalt that I mentioned before. So again, the repo is at the bottom. Our dashboard is there, and you can go there. And maybe if there's too many people trying to use it, they'll crash it. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or to my co-author, Lori, at the emails there below. And so I think that's it. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Roland. Also, sorry for mispronouncing your name at the beginning of the talk.
That's all right.
But yeah, thank you. This is a great talk. It's super interesting, and I think we've got quite a few questions. So I think we can just get started. And also, if you have questions now, feel free to post them in the Q&A, or if you raise your hand, I will bring you up on stage. Okay.
All right.
So our first question is from Andrew Reed. Do you know how this compares to the TAC monitoring tools? Maybe orthogonal. This is Python/module, TAC is CPU, memory / networking.
Actually, Xalt and I think I mentioned Xalt and LMOD. Xalt is developed at TAC. And so I guess there's maybe two questions there. So Xalt has been developed at TAC, and I mentioned in the slide that there is some support for Python monitoring there, and that they use site customize in order to do the monitoring. But it's kind of semi-documented. It's been there for about a year. We were actually using SciCustomize for this monitoring prior to that appearing there. One thing that seems to, and it seems like it's kind of an experimental feature, and that you need to be very careful when you turn it on, because it actually samples when people are doing imports. And you can dial it down so that it only does this like a very small percentage of the time, but it does fire off a sub-process to forward that information. Then in terms of other kinds of monitoring, in terms of CPU usage, memory usage, and things like that, we don't have a lot that does that for users on the Cori system. However, on Perlmutter, we're going to be using a different infrastructure that captures a bit more information about your usage on a CPU node, or on a compute node. So that might get better, but I think that will be a bit different from the TAC deployment. I did want to mention one additional slide that we mentioned in the paper, at least exploring eBPF, just sitting back and relaxing and just monitoring everything that happens. eBPF should have very low overhead, and we'd have to develop tooling to kind of sit there on the compute node and watch everything. But you can try this out yourself. You can install Python calls and kind of profile a little, basically anything. But I don't think we have a tool that can do this just yet.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Our next question is from Bill Little. Are you able to monitor Python usage within Singularity containers on an HPC machine?
So at NERSC, we don't run Singularity. We run Shifter, which is kind of just Docker on HPC. I haven't looked into what would need to be done in order to support Singularity, but I think that what we did here was specific to Shifter, and it might be, since Singularity is open source, the same kind of thing could be done there in principle. The only thing you need to do is to get basically the site customized and everything you need into the user's path, and however you can do that inside Singularity containers at runtime will be just as good.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we have one last question here from Michael Zingale. Are people using user-provided Python because NERSC doesn't have the packages that they need, or is there another reason?
Yeah, it's partially that, but it's also the versions, the versions of them. So, we're kind of in this, we always have this kind of a little bit of a quandary in terms of the software that you deploy, right? You can try to deploy the bleeding edge stuff all the time, but people don't actually want that. They want something kind of stable. Mm-hmm. So what we aim for with the module is to provide kind of a stable environment that we don't change too often. And when we do that, we try to do it at least, no more often than no more frequently than every 6 months. But that's kind of an Anaconda installation, and it doesn't include all of the packages that everybody's going to need for doing their specific science, or it's not going to be able to include the most recent version of every package that people are, with all the features that people are going to need. And so that's part of the freedom that this particular model of letting users kind of manage their own stacks is supposed to address, because otherwise we're kind of in this game of trying to manage enormous combinations of software that can be addressed through tools like SPAC, but this seems to be a very easy way that people are very familiar with when they show up on the system to get ready. We don't try to tell people what Python they ought to be using, but this is kind of the route that we've taken for the past 5 years, and it's worked pretty well. Okay, awesome. Yeah, you're not telling them to not use Python 2.7 anymore? We will do no. We will take no. We will take no action on behalf of users regarding Python 2. I'll put it that way.
Okay, so we actually have 2 more questions, but we are running out of time for this session, and I want to make sure the next speaker in the track gets some time. We do have a nice joke from Maxime Belkin, who is a staff member at NCSA. So maybe you can comment about Colin missing Blue Waters.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
You should talk to him.
Yeah. But Karthik, if you can try to find the speakers maybe at the Gather Town a little bit later, I would encourage you to ask your questions there. Thank you all for attending this session. I encourage you all to go to the next general talk in the general track, which is building the NetworkX developer community, and that will be given by Jared Millman in 5 minutes. So thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Roland and Lori, for your really, really interesting talk, and I loved getting to see this data. This was great.